The early morning sun painted golden streaks across May's diner's weathered floor, casting a warm glow on the vintage checkered tiles that had seen decades of footsteps. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, mixing with the familiar scent of maple syrup and warm butter that always seemed to linger in the cozy establishment. In the corner booth, partially hidden by a curtain of sunlight, sat James Wilson. His presence was as much a part of the diner as the old jukebox that still played forgotten tunes from the 60s. Every morning, like clockwork, he'd walk through those doors at exactly 7:30 a.m., his steps slow but purposeful, his smile gentle but bright enough to light up the room. At 68, James carried himself with the kind of quiet dignity that came from years of service and sacrifice. His coffee cup, always placed on his right side, sent tiny wisps of steam dancing in the morning light. The local newspaper lay spread before him, its pages crinkling softly as he turned them with careful fingers that had seen both war and peace. "Morning, Mr. Wilson," called out Jenny, the young waitress who'd been working at May's for the past 2 years. She didn't need to take his order anymore. Everyone knew it by heart. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, light on the butter, and a side of hash browns that had to be just a little crispy around the edges. James looked up from his paper, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "Good morning, sweetheart," he replied, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd seen the worst of humanity but chose to believe in the best of it. Jenny didn't just see him as another customer. To her, he was the grandfather figure who always asked about her college classes and remembered her mum's surgery date from 3 months ago. The regulars at May's all had their stories about James. There was old Bill from the hardware store, who'd tell anyone who'd listen about the time James spent 4 hours helping him fix his truck in the pouring rain, refusing to take a dime for his trouble. Then there was Mrs. Chen from the flower shop next door, who'd never forget how James had stood guard outside her store during the big storm last year when the power went out. May herself, a woman who'd run the diner for 30 years with calloused hands and an iron will, kept a special coffee mug just for James. It was slightly chipped on one side, with a faded Marine Corps emblem that had seen better days, but James wouldn't have it any other way. "It's got character," he'd always say with a twinkle in his eye. This morning, though, something was different. James had dressed a bit more formally than usual, his pressed shirt and polished shoes suggesting he had somewhere important to be later. A small leather case sat carefully placed beside his newspaper, its presence drawing curious glances from the regular patrons who were used to his usual routine. The morning crowd ebbed and flowed around his corner booth like water around a steady rock. Young professionals rushed in for their coffee fixes, construction workers grabbed their hearty breakfasts, and retired couples lingered over their morning meals. Through it all, James remained in his spot, occasionally nodding hello to familiar faces or offering a kind word to someone who looked like they needed it. What most people didn't know was that James had helped May keep this very diner running during the tough times 10 years ago. He'd never mentioned it, and May only spoke of it in whispers to her closest friends. That was just his way, doing good quietly, without expectation of recognition or reward. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the morning rush began to thin out. James folded his newspaper with practiced precision, each crease exact and purposeful. His eyes, carrying wisdom earned through decades of experience, occasionally drifted to the leather case beside him. Inside lay something that would soon change the atmosphere in this familiar diner dramatically, though none of the breakfast crowd could have guessed it at that moment. The soft chime of the diner's doorbell rang out again, but this time, the comfortable morning routine was about to take an unexpected turn. 2 unfamiliar figures stepped into the warm light of May's diner, their uniforms catching the sunlight, their presence about to disturb the peaceful morning in ways no one could have anticipated. The bell above May's diner door chimed as 2 police officers stepped inside, bringing with them a gust of cool morning air that made the napkins flutter on nearby tables. Officer Thompson and Officer Martinez were new transfers to the local precinct, their uniforms still carrying that overstarched look of people trying too hard to make a good impression in a new place. The diner's warmth seemed to retreat slightly as they entered, like a shy animal sensing unfamiliar presence. These weren't the usual officers who stopped by May's, not Officer Rogers with his booming laugh, or Officer Chen who always ordered extra blueberry pancakes for his kids. These men carried themselves differently, their shoulders tight with the kind of tension that comes from working too long in a tough precinct. Officer Thompson, the taller of the two, ran his hand along his belt as his eyes swept across the diner. Everything about him screamed city cop, from the way he stood slightly sideways to keep his gun hand free, to how his gaze jumped from face to face like he was taking mental photographs. His partner, Officer Martinez, followed close behind, his boots clicking sharply against the checkered floor. "Nice place," Martinez muttered, just loud enough for nearby customers to hear. "Bit different from what we're used to back in the city." His voice carried that edge of someone who'd seen too many bad things and started expecting them everywhere. The morning regulars shifted uncomfortably in their seats, coffee cups pausing halfway to lips, forks hovering over half-eaten eggs. May watched from behind the counter, her experienced eyes noting how these officers were different from her usual law enforcement customers. She'd been running this diner long enough to read people like others read menus, and something about these two made her mentally prepare for trouble. Her hand instinctively moved closer to the phone, just in case. The officers made their way toward the counter, their path taking them past James's corner booth. Thompson's step faltered slightly as his gaze fell on the older man, his expression changing in that subtle way that spoke volumes about preconceived notions and quick judgments. Martinez picked up on his partner's shift in attention, and both officers slowed their pace. Jenny, who had been heading to refill James's coffee, felt the change in atmosphere and hesitated, coffee pot trembling slightly in her hand. The usual morning chatter had died down to a whisper, then to silence. Even the sizzling of bacon on the grill seemed muted, as if the kitchen itself was holding its breath. Officer Thompson's hand remained casually near his belt as he took a half step toward James's booth. His eyes flickered between James and the leather case on the table, his law enforcement training triggering unnecessary suspicion. The morning sun that had earlier bathed the diner in warmth now felt harsh and exposing through the wide windows. The other customers tried to pretend they weren't watching, but their attempts at normalcy were transparent. Bill from the hardware store suddenly became very interested in stirring his coffee, though he'd already finished it. Mrs. Chen's newspaper crinkled too loudly as she pretended to read the same page she'd been on for the past 5 minutes. Martinez leaned slightly toward his partner, whispering something that made Thompson's jaw tighten. Their body language had shifted from casual observation to focused attention, the kind that usually preceded what they called routine questioning, but what others might call harassment. The leather case on James's table seemed to draw their attention like a magnet. It was nothing spectacular, just a simple, well-worn case that could have held anything from reading glasses to business papers. But through their eyes, shaped by years of working in high-crime areas, it represented something potentially suspicious. What happened next would become a story told and retold in May's diner for years to come. The officers' approach, their assumptions, and their actions were about to collide with a reality they never expected. The quiet dignity of their target, the contents of that simple leather case, and the response of the community were about to teach them a lesson more valuable than any police academy training. As Officer Thompson took another step toward James's booth, the morning sun caught something metallic inside the leather case, which was now partially open. That glint of metal would soon change everything, but not in the way anyone might have expected. The tension in the diner reached its peak, like a rubber band stretched to its limit, waiting for the moment of release. Officer Thompson cleared his throat as he reached James's table, his shadow falling across the morning newspaper. "Sir," he said, drawing out the word in a way that made it sound less like respect and more like suspicion. "Mind if we have a word with you?" James looked up from his paper slowly, his weathered hands carefully folding it closed. His eyes, carrying decades of wisdom, met Thompson's gaze with quiet dignity. The diner had grown so quiet you could hear the gentle ticking of the old clock above the counter, marking each second of this tense encounter. "Not at all, officers," James replied, his voice steady and calm, carrying the kind of patience that only comes from having seen far worse situations. "How can I help you this morning?" His hands remained visible on the table, a habit born from years of understanding how quickly people can jump to wrong conclusions. Officer Martinez stepped closer, his boots squeaking against the freshly mopped floor. "We haven't seen you around here before," he said, despite James being a daily fixture at the diner for years. "This is a pretty nice establishment." The implication in his tone hung heavy in the air, unspoken but clear to everyone listening. May gripped her coffee pot tighter behind the counter, her knuckles turning white. She'd seen this scene play out before in other places, but never in her diner. Never to James, of all people. Jenny stood frozen by the kitchen door, fresh pot of coffee forgotten in her trembling hands. Actually, James began, but Officer Thompson cut him off. "What's in the case?" Thompson demanded, nodding toward the leather case on the table. His hand hadn't moved from his belt, a detail that wasn't lost on anyone in the diner. "Mind opening that up for us?" The morning regulars watched with growing discomfort. Bill from the hardware store half rose from his seat, his face reddening with each passing moment. Mrs. Chen had completely abandoned any pretense of reading her newspaper, her usually gentle expression hardened with disapproval. James remained composed, though something flickered in his eyes, not fear, but a deep wariness that spoke of having faced such prejudice too many times before. "Officers," he said quietly, "I've been coming to Maze every morning for the past 5 years. You could ask anyone here." "That's right." May's voice rang out suddenly from behind the counter, unable to stay silent any longer. "James's family here. He's been sitting at that same booth longer than you've probably been wearing that badge." Officer Martinez turned toward May, his expression darkening. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job." Routine questioning. But there was nothing routine about how they'd singled out James, and everyone knew it. The tension in the diner continued to build. The morning sun that had earlier filled the space with warmth now felt like a spotlight on an unwanted drama. Regular customers exchanged glances, a silent communication of shared disbelief and growing anger at the unfair treatment of a man they all knew and respected. James's hands remained steady as he reached for his coffee cup, taking a small sip before setting it down with perfect control. "I understand you're doing your job, officers," he said, his voice carrying no hint of the frustration he must have felt. "But I'd appreciate it if you tell me what exactly has prompted this attention." Officer Thompson's jaw tightened. "Just seems a bit unusual, sir. An expensive-looking case, sitting here alone in this particular." He trailed off, perhaps finally hearing how his words sounded out loud. "This particular what, officer?" James asked quietly, his dignity mounting with each word. "This particular diner, or is it something else that seems unusual to you?" The question hung in the air like smoke, making everyone present shift uncomfortably in their seats. Even Officer Martinez seemed to realize they'd crossed a line, though pride kept him from backing down immediately. The leather case sat between them like a silent witness, its presence now charged with meaning beyond its simple appearance. What those officers didn't know, what they couldn't have known through their cloud of prejudice, was that inside that case lay something that would soon make them question everything about their approach to this situation. As Officer Thompson reached for the case, his face set in grim determination, no one in the diner could have predicted how the next few moments would unfold. The revelation that was about to come would do more than just change the dynamic of this confrontation. It would become a powerful lesson about prejudice, respect, and the danger of judging others based on appearance alone. Time seemed to slow down as Officer Thompson's hand reached for the leather case. The morning sunlight streaming through May's diner windows caught the slight tremor in his fingers, perhaps from adrenaline, perhaps from something deeper, some small voice of conscience trying to break through his predetermined judgments. James made no move to stop him, sitting perfectly still with the same quiet dignity he'd shown since the officers first approached. His eyes, though, held a glimmer of something that might have been sadness, or perhaps disappointment, not for himself, but for the situation, for the lessons still unlearned after all these years. The case's brass clasp made a soft clicking sound as it opened. The sound seemed to echo through the silent diner, where every patron held their breath. May had stopped pretending to wipe the counter, her cleaning cloth frozen mid-swipe. Jenny stood by the coffee machine, the fresh pot long forgotten, her young face a mixture of worry and anticipation. As the lid lifted, the morning sun caught something inside, something that made both officers freeze in their tracks. There, nestled in deep blue velvet, lay the Medal of Honor, its golden surface catching the light like a star fallen to earth. Beside it, crisp and official, lay a letter bearing the presidential seal. Officer Thompson's hand jerked back as if the medal had burned him. His face, which moments ago had worn such certainty, now drained of color as recognition dawned. Every police officer, every service member knew what that medal meant. They knew how rare it was, how precious, how few lived to receive it, and how many died earning it. "Sir, is that—" Officer Martinez couldn't even finish his sentence. His earlier smugness had evaporated, replaced by a look of stunned realization. James slowly reached out and lifted the medal from its velvet bed. The chain clanked softly as it caught the light. "Yes," he said quietly. "I received this about an hour ago. Was just sitting here, letting it sink in. 50 years is a long time to wait, but some memories, some actions, time doesn't change them." The letter beside the medal told the story in official language, how a young soldier had carried 3 wounded men to safety under heavy fire, how he'd returned again and again into danger to save others, how his actions had preserved the lives of an entire platoon. The paper spoke of extraordinary valor and distinguished service, but those formal words could hardly capture the reality of that distant day. Mrs. Chen had her hand over her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Bill from the hardware store sat with his head bowed, his own service medals from a different war suddenly feeling heavy on his chest at home. Even the youngest customers in the diner seemed to understand the weight of this moment, the profound significance of what they were witnessing. Officer Thompson's face had transformed. The suspicious, hard-edged look he'd worn earlier had crumbled, replaced by something that looked very much like shame. His partner had taken a step back, as if trying to physically distance himself from their earlier behavior. "Sir," Thompson began, his voice cracking slightly, "we didn't." James held up a hand, gentle but firm. "The medal isn't what makes a person worthy of respect, officers." His voice remained kind, but carried an authority that had nothing to do with rank or decoration. "It's not about what's in this case, it's about what's in here." He touched his chest lightly. The sun chose that moment to break through a passing cloud, flooding the diner with even brighter light. It illuminated the medal, sending ribbons of golden reflection dancing across the walls. But more striking was how it lit up James's face, highlighting not triumph or vindication, but a deep, patient wisdom. May had moved closer now, standing near James's table like a protective guardian. Her eyes glistened with pride, not just for James's medal, but for the way he was handling this moment. She'd seen him face challenging situations before, but this was something special. The other customers in the diner had become more than just witnesses. They were now part of something important, something that would be remembered and retold. They were watching more than just a revelation of military honors. They were seeing a masterclass in dignity, in handling prejudice with grace, in turning a moment of conflict into an opportunity for understanding. As the medal caught another ray of sunlight, its gleam seemed to illuminate more than just the physical space. It was lighting up assumptions, biases, and prejudices, showing them for what they were, shadows that couldn't stand up to the bright light of truth and human dignity. The atmosphere in May's diner had transformed completely. The tension that had filled the air moments ago was replaced by something else, a mixture of awe, respect, and dawning understanding. Officer Thompson stood rooted to the spot, his earlier confidence replaced by visible regret, while Officer Martinez kept opening and closing his mouth, searching for words that wouldn't come. "Please, sit down," James said softly, gesturing to the empty seats across from him. His invitation carried no hint of triumph or accusation, just simple human kindness. The same kindness May realized that he'd shown every single day for the past 5 years, whether he was helping her fix the old ceiling fan or teaching Jenny's little brother how to solve math problems. The officers hesitated, their discomfort evident in every movement. Finally, they slid into the booth, their uniforms suddenly seeming too stiff, too formal for this humble diner setting. The morning sun continued to play across the Medal of Honor, its golden surface a silent reminder of valor and sacrifice. "Vietnam," James said quietly, answering their unasked question. 1968, just outside of a small village. His eyes grew distant for a moment, seeing something far beyond the diner's walls. "You know, the funny thing is, when you're in that moment, you don't think about medals or recognition. You just think about the people next to you, about getting them home safely." Jenny approached with fresh coffee cups for the officers, her hands steady now, her young face showing a mixture of pride and protectiveness toward James. As she poured, Officer Thompson noticed how carefully she positioned the cup near James's right hand, a small detail that spoke volumes about how well the diner's staff knew and cared for him. "Sir," Officer Thompson began, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say. We were completely wrong." James finished gently. "Yes, you were. But being wrong isn't the problem. It's what we learn from it that matters." He carefully picked up the medal, letting it rest in his weathered palm. "You see this? It's not just about what I did. It's about what we're all capable of, both the good and the bad." The other customers in the diner had drawn closer now, forming a respectful circle around the booth. Bill from the hardware store stepped forward, pulling something from his wallet, a faded photograph of himself in uniform, standing next to a much younger James in Vietnam. "I never knew," Bill said, his voice rough with emotion. "All these years fixing cars together, sharing coffee, and I never knew you were the one. The one they told us about in training, the soldier who went back 3 times under heavy fire to save his whole unit." Mrs. Chen wiped tears from her eyes as she shared her own story. 2 winters ago, during the big storm, Mr. Wilson stood guard outside my shop all night. The power was out, and he was worried about looters. Never asked for anything in return, just said it was the right thing to do." One by one, other patrons began sharing their stories about James, small acts of kindness, moments of quiet generosity, words of wisdom shared over morning coffee. Each story added another layer to the portrait of a man who had lived his life with the same courage and compassion he'd shown on that distant battlefield. Officer Martinez looked down at his badge, then back at James. "We're supposed to protect and serve," he said quietly. "But today, we let our assumptions do the thinking for us. We forgot to see the person in front of us." Mai stepped forward, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "That medal isn't what makes him special," she said firmly. "It's who he is every single day. The way he treats people. The way he makes this place better just by being part of it." James smiled at her words, but shook his head slightly. "We all have it in us to be better," he said. "Sometimes we just need a reminder." He carefully returned the medal to its case, but left it open on the table, not as a rebuke, but as a bridge of understanding. The morning light had shifted now, casting longer shadows across the diner's floor. But something else had shifted too. Perspectives had changed, assumptions had crumbled, and in their place, a new understanding was taking root. The officers' faces showed the profound impact of this lesson, one that no police academy training could have taught them quite so powerfully. The next few minutes in May's diner unfolded like pages from a book that needed to be written. People who had been quietly watching now stepped forward, one by one, each carrying their own story about James Wilson, stories that painted a picture far richer than any medal could capture. An elderly gentleman using a cane slowly made his way to the booth. "My name's Robert," he said, his voice trembling slightly with age but firm with purpose. 3 years ago, my wife passed away. I was in a dark place, didn't want to leave the house." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But every morning, James here would walk past my house on his way to the diner. Every single morning, he'd stop and wave. Eventually, he got me to start walking with him. Now look at me. I haven't missed a breakfast here in 2 years." The young man who delivered the diner supplies spoke up next. "Last winter, my truck broke down during the big snowstorm. Called every mechanic in town, but nobody would come out. Mr. Wilson here drove out in his old pickup, spent 3 hours helping me fix it in the freezing cold. Wouldn't take a dime for it." Officer Thompson and Martinez sat in silence, their coffee untouched, as person after person stepped forward. Each story revealed another facet of the man they had so quickly judged, each memory adding to the weight of their mistake. A woman in her 30s, wearing scrubs from the local hospital, shared her story next. "I was working double shifts, trying to pay for nursing school," she said, smiling at James. "Every morning, he'd save the crossword puzzle from his newspaper for me. Said it would keep my mind sharp for my studies, but what I didn't know then was that he'd been quietly talking to the hospital board about their scholarship program. I graduated last year debt-free." Mai stepped away from the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. 5 years ago, this diner was about to close down, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. The bank was ready to foreclose. I'd lost hope. She looked at James with gratitude shining in her eyes. One morning, James asked to see my books. Turns out he used to be an accountant before the war. He spent weeks helping me restructure everything, negotiate with the bank. He even convinced other vets to start having their monthly meetings here. Never wanted any credit for it. Jenny, the young waitress, couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Remember the youth center that opened last year?" she asked the officers. "The one that gives kids a safe place to go after school. Mr. Wilson volunteers there 3 afternoons a week. Helps with homework, teaches chess, listens to kids who just need someone to talk to. My little brother says he's the best teacher he's ever had." Bill from the hardware store pulled out his phone, showing a photo of last year's Veterans Day parade. There was James, not in the parade himself, but standing on the sidelines, helping an elderly veteran in a wheelchair hold his flag high. "That's just who he is," Bill said simply, always thinking of others before himself. Mrs. Chen spoke softly about how James had helped her learn English, spending countless patient hours over coffee, never once making her feel embarrassed about her mistakes. "He told me everyone has a story worth telling," she said, her accent carrying the warmth of gratitude. "We just need someone willing to listen." The officers' faces showed the impact of each story, their earlier prejudices crumbling under the weight of this community's love and respect for James. Officer Martinez looked down at his badge again, as if seeing it in a new light. "We're supposed to know our community," he said quietly. "But this is what it really means." Through it all, James sat quietly, neither proud nor embarrassed by the outpouring of stories. His humility in the face of such praise only served to underscore the truth of every word being spoken. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting its warm light across the diner like a blessing, touching each face in the growing circle of people who had come forward to speak. The Medal of Honor still lay in its open case, but somehow it seemed less important now. The real measure of the man wasn't in the medal he'd earned in a single day of valor, but in the thousands of small acts of kindness that had followed in the years since, the daily choices to serve his community in quiet, meaningful ways. The morning had grown older, but nobody in May's diner seemed ready to leave. The usual breakfast rush had given way to something more important, a moment of transformation that everyone could feel in the air. Officer Thompson finally broke the weighted silence, standing up from the booth with purpose in his movements. "Mr. Wilson," he began, his voice carrying a new kind of respect, "I want to apologize. Not just for today, but for every time someone like me has judged you without knowing your story." His partner, Officer Martinez, stood as well, removing his cap in a gesture of respect. James looked up at them, his eyes carrying wisdom earned through decades of similar encounters. "You know," he said softly, "the hardest battles we fight aren't always the ones with bullets and bombs. Sometimes they're the battles within ourselves, against our own prejudices and assumptions." The diner had fallen silent again, everyone listening intently as James continued. "But here's the thing about battles, they're opportunities for change. Every mistake can be a stepping stone to something better if we're willing to learn from it." Officer Thompson reached for his notebook, but instead of writing a report, he wrote down his phone number. "Sir, we're starting a new community outreach program at the precinct. Would you be willing to come speak to our officers? Share your experiences. I think there are lessons here that we all need to hear." James smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he'd been waiting for an opportunity just like this. "Sometimes," he said, "the best way to bridge a gap is to build from both sides. Yes, I'd be honored to speak with your officers." Mai stepped forward, coffee pot in hand, refilling cups that had gone cold during the morning's events. "You know what makes this place special?" she asked, gesturing around her diner. "It's not the food, though I'd like to think that helps. It's that everyone who comes through that door has a chance to be part of something bigger than themselves." The morning sun had risen fully now, streaming through the windows and catching dust motes in its beams, making them dance like tiny stars. Jenny began clearing tables, but she moved differently now, with a new appreciation for the simple dignity of service, something she'd learned from watching James all these years. "You wear that badge to protect and serve," James said to the officers, his voice gentle but firm. "But sometimes the best protection we can offer is understanding. The best service is seeing people for who they really are, not who we assume them to be." Officer Martinez pulled out his own notebook. "Would you mind if I took down some notes about your experiences, sir? Not for any report, but for myself. I think I need to remember this day." James nodded, but pointed around the diner. "Make sure you write down their stories too. Every person here is part of this lesson. Every voice matters in making change real. The next hour unfolded naturally, with the officers sitting back down, this time as students rather than authority figures. They listened as James shared more stories, not just of his military service, but of the everyday battles against prejudice, the small victories of changing minds one person at a time, the importance of maintaining dignity in the face of judgment. Other customers drifted in and out of the diner, catching pieces of the conversation, each taking away something valuable. Old Bill started organizing a weekly veterans coffee meeting. Mrs. Chen offered to share her own stories of overcoming prejudice. The young delivery man began planning community service projects with the officers. As the morning wound down, James carefully closed the leather case containing his Medal of Honor. "This medal," he said, tapping the case gently, "it's just metal and ribbon. The real medal is what we do with each new day we're given, how we treat each other, how we learn from our mistakes, how we make our community stronger." The officers stood to leave, but something had changed in their stance. They carried themselves differently now, with more humility and awareness. "We'll be back tomorrow," Officer Thompson said, not as a warning, but as a promise to do better, to be better. James smiled, folding his newspaper and preparing for his own departure. "Tomorrow's always a new chance to get it right," he said. "That's the beautiful thing about mornings. They're fresh starts for everyone." May watched from behind her counter as the day settled back into its routine, but she knew nothing would ever be quite the same. Her diner had become more than just a place for coffee and eggs. It had become a classroom for human understanding. A place where prejudice could transform into respect, where mistakes could lead to growth. And there, in his usual corner booth by the window, James Wilson would continue his quiet work of changing the world, one cup of coffee, one conversation, one heart at a time.